The microphone in my hand went dead in the middle of my own rehearsal dinner toast. My mother leaned toward my sister and said, "Well, that was more interesting than anything she was going to say anyway." I did not cry. I did not respond. I just stood there under the string lights, holding a dead microphone, and I started counting. My name is Lauren Rogers. I am 32 years old. I run projects for a living. I read rooms for a living. And on the night before my wedding, I watched a soundboard fail twice, at exactly the two moments that mattered most, and my mother smiled both times. If you have ever had a parent smile when something breaks that belongs to you, go ahead and hit like right now and subscribe before you keep listening, because you already know where this is going. Tell me in the comments what city you're in and what time it is where you are. I want to know how many of us are hearing this same story tonight, in the same kind of quiet kitchen, holding the same kind of memory. Here's the rewind, and I'll keep it short because the story is really about one night, not 30 years of one. Rogers Manor was my grandmother's. Valerie Rogers built it from a falling down farmhouse into the kind of venue people wait 14 months to book. She ran it the way she ran everything, with a ledger she trusted more than most people. After she passed, my sister Melissa took over the day-to-day. My father, Dennis, stepped back. My mother, Lori, had never worked a single event in her life, but she started showing up anyway, mostly to stand near Melissa and nod. I didn't fight for a piece of the business. I had my own career, and weddings were never going to be my life's work. I only ever wanted one night there, my own. And Melissa knew that when she agreed to host my rehearsal dinner at the Manor for free, as what she called her gift to me. I should have priced that gift more carefully. The rehearsal dinner was set for the back lawn, string lights, 40 guests, a sound system Melissa was proud of, all wireless, all networked through one central board she controlled from a laptop near the bar. I remember her walking me through it 2 days before, tapping the screen like she was showing me a nursery she'd decorated herself. "Every mic on this lawn runs through me," she said. "I can hear anything, mute anything, from right here." I laughed when she said it. I thought she meant it as a comfort. The night came in, warm and gold. My father gave a short toast, easy, familiar, the kind of thing he'd probably rehearsed in the car. Then it was my turn. I stood up to thank everyone, to thank Valerie's memory for the roof over our heads, and halfway through the second sentence, my microphone cut out. Not static, not a fade. A clean, immediate silence, the kind that only happens when someone flips a switch. I tapped it once. Nothing. I looked toward the sound tech, a young guy named Wes who'd been hired for the night, and he was already halfway out of his chair, staring at his own board like it had lied to him. I mouthed, "Is it dead?" And he shook his head no, and mouthed back, muted. I want you to sit with that word for a second, the way I had to sit with it standing in front of 40 people. Muted, not broken, chosen. I did the only thing you can do in that position without making it worse. I smiled. I said something light about technology having its own opinions tonight, and I sat back down before it turned into a bigger moment than it needed to be. Wes fixed it inside of 90 seconds. I finished my toast to polite applause and the particular kind of silence that happens when a room isn't sure what it just watched. 20 minutes later, my best friend since college, who was serving as my maid of honor, stood up to give her toast, and it happened again. Same clean cut, same dead air. She looked at me from the front of the tent, confused, tapping the mic exactly the way I had, and I watched my mother, 3 seats down from me, lean toward Melissa and say the line I opened this story with. Then my mother smiled, not embarrassed, not apologetic, pleased. I did not cry. I did not respond. What I did instead was quieter than anything anyone at that table would have noticed. I turned toward Wes, caught his eye, and mouthed one thing. "Keep the log." He nodded, small, like he understood exactly what I was asking and exactly why I was asking it in silence instead of out loud. Every mute command on a networked board like that gets time-stamped. Somewhere in that laptop was a record of who had touched what and when. Melissa had told me herself 2 days earlier, tapping that screen like a proud parent. Every mic on this lawn runs through me. She just hadn't thought about what that meant if someone ever asked to see the receipts. My sister spent the rest of dinner working the room the way she always does at the manor, refilling glasses, laughing at the right moments, playing the gracious host who'd generously donated the venue for her little sister's big weekend. Nobody but Wes and me knew that host had also, twice, reached over and silenced 2 women mid-sentence in front of everyone they loved. I watched her do it, and I thought about my grandmother's ledger, the one Valerie used to keep locked in the estate office at the manor, the one nobody had opened since she died. I didn't know yet what was in it. I only knew, watching my sister laugh with a glass of wine in her hand, that some people believe the room will always forgive them, because it always has. Truth is the slowest receipt there is, and that night it was only just starting to add up. The dinner wound down close to 11. Guests drifted toward their cars. The string lights dimmed on a timer, and I stayed behind to help stack a few chairs, mostly because I needed a few quiet minutes before I had to go home and lie in bed next to my fiancé and decide how much of this to tell him. That's when I saw Stephen crossing the lawn toward me. Stephen had been Valerie's attorney for as long as I could remember, and he'd stayed close to the family after she passed, close enough that nobody thought twice about him being at the rehearsal dinner at all. He was carrying something in his hand, a plain envelope, cream-colored, sealed, with my name written across the front in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere, because it was my grandmother's. "She asked me to give you this," he said, at the right moment. "I think tonight qualifies." I looked at the envelope, then at him. Tonight was the right moment, I said, for a lot of things, apparently. He didn't ask what I meant. He'd been standing near the back of the tent both times the microphones died. I think he already knew exactly what I meant. "There's more than a letter coming, Lauren," he said, quiet enough that only I could hear it. "Come see me in the morning. Bring coffee. Bring patience." He glanced once toward the house where I could still see my mother's silhouette in the kitchen window, and something in his face tightened before he caught himself. "You're going to want to sit down for it." I took the envelope from him and held it the way you hold something you already know is going to change the shape of your week. I didn't open it there on the lawn, in front of stacked chairs and cooling string lights. Some things you don't read standing up. I went home that night, envelope on the seat beside me, and I did not tell my fiancé everything. Not yet. I told him the mics had glitched, that it was embarrassing, that I was fine. He believed me because I've always been good at sounding fine. But I lay awake a long time, thinking about a locked ledger, a laptop with a log I'd asked a stranger to save, and a letter from a woman who'd been gone long enough that I'd stopped expecting to hear from her at all. Whatever Valerie had written to me, she hadn't written it for a random Tuesday. She'd written it and sealed it and handed it to Stephen to hold until the exact night my sister decided silence was a gift she got to hand out. I fell asleep still holding the envelope, and I woke up the next morning already certain of one thing. I wasn't going to open it alone. The morning came in flat and gray, the kind of light that makes you feel like you slept less than you did. I was up before my alarm, showered, dressed in jeans instead of the robe my mother had left folded on the guest bed weeks ago with a note that said "for the big day." And I drove to Stephen's office with 2 coffees and the envelope on the passenger seat, still sealed. I hadn't opened it. Not because I wasn't curious, because some letters you want to open in front of a witness so that whatever it says becomes real the moment you read it, not something you can talk yourself out of later. Stephen's office was above a bakery downtown, small, the kind of place with a coffee ring already worn into the desk from 30 years of clients sitting exactly where I was sitting. He wasn't alone. There was a man at the side table with a laptop open and a stack of paper clipped in careful, color-coded sections, and Stephen introduced him before I even sat down. "This is Craig Patel," he said, "forensic accountant. I brought him in about 5 weeks ago, quietly, to go through the Manor's books. Craig, this is Lauren." Craig Patel nodded at me, the kind of nod you give someone you already feel sorry for. "I've heard a lot about you this morning," he said. "None of it from anyone trying to make you feel better." I sat down across from both of them, coffee in hand, and I said, "I want to open something first, if that's all right." Stephen didn't argue. I broke the seal on my grandmother's letter right there at his desk, and I read it twice before I trusted myself to say anything out loud. It wasn't long. Valerie never wasted words when she was alive, and she hadn't started in death either. She wrote that she'd watched Melissa run the manor with one hand on the books, and the other hand always finding a reason to keep me at arm's length from them. She wrote that trust, real trust, isn't something you hand to the person who wants it loudest. She wrote that she'd made a change to her estate documents the year before she died, quietly through Stephen, and that she was sorry it had to arrive like this instead of from her own mouth while she still had one. She didn't explain the change in the letter. She just told me to trust Stephen when he showed me the rest. I set the letter down on the desk, face up, and looked at him. "So show me the rest." Stephen slid a folder across the desk. Not the letter. Something thicker. "This is Valerie's second amendment to the family trust," he said, "executed 14 months before she passed. It restructures control of Rogers Manor. As of that document, you are the controlling member, not Melissa." I stared at the page in front of me, at Valerie's signature, at Stephen's own notarization beside it, and I felt something in my chest that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief. It was closer to recognition, like a door I'd never noticed had been standing open the whole time. "Melissa doesn't know this exists," I said. It wasn't a question. "No one outside this office knows it exists," Stephen said. "Valerie asked me to hold it until the right moment. She didn't define the moment for me in writing. She trusted me to know it when I saw it." He glanced toward the string of lights I could still picture strung across the lawn behind my eyes, and I understood exactly what moment he meant. Craig Patel cleared his throat and turned his laptop toward me. "There's a reason Valerie made that change, and it isn't just family politics," he said. "I was brought in to look at vendor contracts across the last several years of manor operations. One in particular stood out early. Leon Party Rentals. I knew the name. Leon Party Rentals had done the tables, the chairs, half the tenting for every event at the manor for as long as I could remember. I'd assumed they were just the vendor Melissa liked working with. They're the vendor Melissa approves invoices for personally," Craig Patel said. "No one else signs off on that account. And when I laid the actual rental volume against what the manor was billed, the numbers don't match. Not once or twice. Consistently. Over years." He turned the screen so I could see columns, dates, invoice numbers next to delivery logs that told a different story than the paperwork did. Some of what got billed as rented never got delivered at all. Some got billed at double the going rate, with the difference routed back through a service fee that doesn't correspond to any service anyone can identify. I looked at the numbers a long time. I didn't ask him to say the word skimming out loud. I didn't need to. I just asked, "How long has this been happening?" "Long enough that it isn't a mistake anymore," he said. "It's a pattern. And patterns like this don't usually run through one person alone. Somebody has to look the other way on the approvals for it to keep working quietly." I thought about my mother standing near Melissa at every single event for years, nodding, never once running the board herself, never once questioning a number. I thought about her smiling under the string lights when my microphone died, twice, and I understood sitting in that office with a coffee going cold in my hand that I wasn't only looking at a fraud. I was looking at a family that had built an entire quiet arrangement to keep me exactly where they wanted me. Grateful for a free venue, grateful for a gift, never asking who was really paying for it. "I want to see everything," I said. "Every invoice, every log, every year you can pull." "I can have a full report exported by this afternoon," Craig Patel said. "I already anticipated you'd want it in a form you could hand to someone else if it came to that." Stephen leaned forward, hands folded on the desk. Lauren, I have to ask you something, and I need you to actually think about it before you answer. You get married tonight, at the manor, with your entire family in that room. Do you want this handled quietly through proper channels on your own timeline after the wedding is over? Or do you want it handled tonight? I thought about the answer for exactly as long as it took me to remember the sound of my own voice cutting out mid-sentence, and my mother leaning in to say that was more interesting than anything she was going to say anyway. Tonight, I said, in front of everyone who's ever pretended not to notice. Stephen didn't smile exactly, but something in his face settled, like a decision he'd been carrying got set down. Then there's one more thing you need to know before this afternoon, he said, and it isn't about Craig's report. I waited. The sound system at the manor for tonight's reception, he said, is the same networked board Melissa runs from her laptop, the one that went down twice last night. He paused. If she's willing to mute you at your own rehearsal dinner in front of 40 people, I don't think either of us should assume she won't try again in front of 200. I sat back in my chair and thought about Wes, and the log I'd asked him to keep, and the word he'd mouthed to me across the tent. Muted. Not broken. Chosen. She won't get the chance, I said. I spent the next 2 hours on the phone instead of finishing my coffee. I called the wedding coordinator first, a woman I trusted because she'd never once let Melissa steamroll her on a timeline. And I asked her quietly to bring in an independent sound company for the reception, completely separate hardware, its own battery packs, its own receivers, nothing wired into the manor's existing board at all. I told her I wanted it set up under the tent an hour before doors, and I told her exactly one thing about why, which was nothing. Melissa's going to ask why there's a second setup, the coordinator said. Tell her it's a backup, I said. Tell her I got nervous after last night. That's not even a lie. I called Wes next. He picked up on the second ring, and before I could even finish asking, he said, I already exported the log this morning. Every mute command time-stamped, both instances, tied to the laptop she was running from her end of the bar. I figured you'd want it before you asked. You didn't have to do that on your own, I said. I watched her do it twice to 2 women who never did anything to her, he said. I didn't need to be asked. I thanked him, and I meant it more than the words could really carry, and I hung up and sat for a minute in my car outside Stephen's office with the folder from Craig Patel on the seat where the envelope had been the night before. Somewhere behind me, my mother and my sister were probably already at the manor, walking the lawn, checking the tables, rehearsing tonight's version of themselves. Gracious host, proud mother. The same 2 roles they'd been playing for years, propped up by a ledger nobody had thought to open and a laptop nobody had thought to question. I looked at the folder, then at my phone, then at the time. There were still hours before I had to be dressed, hours before 200 people would fill that tent expecting a wedding and getting something else entirely. I started the car and pulled out of the lot, and for the first time since the microphone went dead in my hand under those string lights, I didn't feel like I was holding my breath anymore. I felt like I was finally counting towards something with an actual sum at the end of it. I got dressed in my childhood bedroom, the one with the water stain on the ceiling shaped like a state I never bothered to identify, and my mother stood behind me doing the buttons on the back of my dress like she'd done it 100 times, even though this was the only time she'd ever get to. You look beautiful, she said, and I watched her face in the mirror while she said it, and I thought, you have no idea what's coming tonight, and some small, cruel part of me almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Not enough to say anything. Thank you, I said, and that was all I gave her. Melissa knocked twice and let herself in before I answered, the way she always did, wearing the pale green dress she'd picked out for herself as maid of honor months ago, holding 2 mimosas like the whole morning owed her a toast. To my baby sister, she said, handing me a glass I didn't ask for. Marrying into a family that actually shows up for things. I looked at her over the rim of the glass and thought about a laptop at the end of a bar, a log with 2 timestamps on it, an envelope with my name in my grandmother's handwriting. I smiled, small, and said, cheers to that. I didn't drink much of it. I needed my head clear for a night I already knew was going to ask a lot of me. She left to go check on the tent, still humming, still certain the day belonged to her the way every day at the manor eventually did, and my mother finished the last button and turned me around by the shoulders to look at me properly. "I know last night wasn't perfect," she said, and for 1 second I thought maybe she'd caught herself, maybe some part of her understood what she'd smiled at. Then she kept going. "But microphones are the least important thing about a wedding, Lauren. Nobody remembers the sound system. They remember how happy you looked." I did not answer her the way I wanted to. I only said, "You're right. Nobody's going to forget tonight." She heard it as agreement. I heard it as a promise to myself. The ceremony happened the way ceremonies do when you're standing in the middle of your own life instead of watching it. Vows, a ring, my father's hand shaking slightly when he walked me those last few steps, which surprised me, because Dennis had never once in my life seemed like a man who trembled at anything. I caught his eye for half a second before he let go of my arm, and there was something in his face I couldn't name yet. Something that looked almost like an apology he didn't have the words for. I filed it away. I had a folder full of things to file away that day, and that was only one more. By the time the ceremony ended and the tent opened up for the reception, the light had gone gold and low across the lawn, the same lawn where 2 microphones had died the night before, and I walked in on my husband's arm past round tables, dressed in white linen, past the string lights back on their timer, past my mother beaming at every guest who told her how lovely the venue was, how generous of Melissa to host it here for free. I smelled it before I saw it. That signature nobody but the family and the caterers knew was a signature at all. The particular hum of the manor pretending everything ran the way it always had. Near the head table, off to one side where the guests wouldn't notice it among the flowers, sat a second sound rig. Its own speakers, its own little mixing unit, a coil of cable that went nowhere near the manor's main board at all. I'd walked past it twice already, and each time it steadied something in my chest that had been unsteady since the string lights went out the night before. Melissa noticed it before dinner service even started. Of course she did. She noticed everything that touched her soundboard, the way some people notice everything that touches their money. She came over while I was greeting a table of my husband's cousins, leaned in close, voice pitched for just me. "What is that set up by the flowers?" she said. "Did the venue coordinator not clear that with me?" "It's a backup," I said. After last night, I got nervous. Something flickered behind her eyes. Fast. There and gone. The look of someone doing quiet math she didn't like the answer to. "You didn't need to do that," she said. "I run a tight board, Lauren. 2 glitches in one night doesn't mean anything." "I know," I said. "I just feel better having it." I smiled at her the exact width of smile she'd given me over mimosas that morning, and I watched her decide, visibly, that it wasn't worth arguing about in front of guests. She patted my arm like she was the one being generous and went back to her post at the bar, where her laptop sat open, glowing, tethered to a board that, as far as she knew, still owned every microphone under that tent. Dinner service moved the way wedding dinners move, plates cleared, wine poured, the low murmur of 200 people being polite to each other in formal wear. Stephen found me near the edge of the dance floor while the band took their first break. Craig Patel, a few steps behind him, holding a folder I recognized even from across the tent, the same color-coded sections from that morning's desk. Stephen didn't say much. He didn't need to. "Sound check on your setup came back clean," he said. "Independent power, independent receivers. Nothing on that board touches anything Melissa can reach from her laptop." "And the toasts," I said. "Right after the cake is cut," Stephen said. "That's your slot. That's when the room's fullest, and nobody's left yet." He glanced toward the bar, toward my sister laughing with a guest, toward my mother refilling someone's glass with the same easy hand she'd used to pour compliments about the venue all night. "Lauren, once I start reading, there's no folding this back up. You understand that?" "I've understood that since this morning," I said. Craig Patel held the folder out slightly, not quite handing it over yet, just letting me see the tab on the side that read, "Leon Party Rentals," in his own neat handwriting. "The moment this comes out," he said, "it stops being a family disagreement. It becomes something with a dollar figure attached to it, and dollar figures don't stay quiet once somebody official hears them." "Good," I said. "I'm done keeping it quiet for her." The cake sat at the far end of the head table. 3 tiers, white icing, a detail my mother had chosen without asking me, the same way she'd chosen the robe folded on my bed with a note that said "for the big day." I looked at it and thought about how much of tonight had been decided for me, quietly, by people who assumed I'd never look closely enough to notice. Then I thought about the folder in Craig Patel's hand and the laptop at the bar that thought it still controlled every voice in that room, and I understood that for the first time in longer than I could count, tonight was going to be decided by me. The band leader tapped his microphone, testing it, and the sound came through clean and even, my sound, not hers. Across the tent, I saw Melissa glance up from her laptop toward the stage, frowning slightly at a signal she hadn't sent, and something in my chest went very still and very calm, the way water goes still right before it's about to do something. Stephen straightened his jacket. Craig Patel opened the folder just enough to slide the first page free, and somewhere behind the cake table, my mother was already smiling again, the same pleased, satisfied smile from the night before, with no idea at all what that smile was about to cost her. Stephen didn't wait for the band to come back from break. He walked to the small stage where the toast microphone stood, my microphone, wired into nothing but its own battery pack and its own little speaker off to the side, and he tapped it twice with one finger. The sound came through the tent clean and immediate, and every head turned the way heads turn when a microphone works exactly the way a microphone is supposed to. "If I could have everyone's attention for just a few minutes," he said, "before we get back to dancing." I watched my mother's face from where I stood near the cake table. She smiled the way she smiled at every toast, hands folded, chin tilted, ready to receive whatever kind words were coming her way. She had no idea yet that this wasn't that. "My name is Stephen," he said, though most of the room already knew that, and some of you know I'm an attorney. What you don't know is that for the last several weeks, I've also been handling something on behalf of my wife, related to her grandmother's estate. He held up a single sheet of paper, plain, unremarkable, the kind of document that never looks like it's about to change anything. "This is the Second Amendment to Valerie Rogers's trust, the trust that owns and operates Rogers Manor. It was signed and witnessed 14 months before she passed, and it has never been read aloud to this family. Tonight, at my wife's request, I'm going to read it." Somewhere near the bar, I saw Melissa go still. Not dramatic, just still, the particular stillness of someone doing quiet math again, faster this time. Stephen read it plainly, no performance in his voice, which somehow made it land harder than if he'd tried to make it sound important. The language was simple. Valerie Rogers, of sound mind, amended the terms of her trust to designate her granddaughter, Lauren, as controlling member of Rogers Manor, effective upon her passing, superseding any prior designation naming her granddaughter, Melissa, in that role. The tent went quiet in a way 200 people going quiet all at once actually sounds like, a kind of pressure change. "I want to be clear about what that means," Stephen said, "because I know some of you are already trying to talk yourselves out of what you just heard. It means that for the past several years, every decision made in this venue's name, every vendor approved, every invoice signed, was made by someone who was never legally the person entitled to make it." My mother's smile hadn't moved yet. It was frozen there, the way a smile gets frozen when the person wearing it hasn't caught up to what's happening around it. "Which brings me to why that matters tonight specifically," Stephen said, and he nodded toward Craig Patel, who stepped up beside him holding the folder I'd watched him tab that morning. "This is Craig Patel. He's a forensic accountant. I asked him to review vendor contracts at the manor going back several years, and what he found is documented, dated, and sourced directly from invoices and delivery records that this venue kept itself. Craig Patel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The tent was already leaning toward him. One vendor account stood out, he said. Leon Party Rentals. Tables, chairs, tenting. For every event held here for years. One person approved every invoice on that account personally, with no secondary review. When I compared what was billed against what was actually delivered, the numbers didn't reconcile. Equipment billed that was never dropped off. Rates billed at double the standard, with the difference routed through a service fee that doesn't correspond to any documented service. Consistently. Over years. He let that sit before he said the rest. The person who approved every one of those invoices is standing at the bar right now. I didn't look at Melissa. I looked at my mother instead, because I wanted to see the exact second it landed. The second the smile finally cracked. It didn't crack all at once. It just slid, slowly, the way ice slides off a roof once the sun's been on it long enough. Melissa's voice came first, sharp, too fast. This is insane. This is my wedding gift to my sister, and you're standing up here accusing me of stealing from my own family's business. It's not an accusation, Craig Patel said. It's a finding. The documentation is available to anyone who wants to see it, including eventually whoever the family's attorney recommends for a civil claim. I stepped forward then, because this next part was mine to say. Not Stephen's, not Craig Patel's. I took the small clip microphone from where it sat on the linen near the cake, the one wired into my own independent rig, and I turned it on with my own hand. There's one more thing, I said, and my voice came through clean, even, mine, exactly the way it hadn't the night before. Last night, during my rehearsal dinner, my microphone went dead. Twice. Both times right as I started speaking. I want everyone here to know that wasn't a malfunction. Melissa's face did something complicated, a flash of calculation crossing into something closer to fear. Lauren, don't do this. Not here. I have a sound engineer who was running the board last night, I said. He kept a log, every command, every mute, time-stamped, tied to the laptop at the end of the bar. I nodded, and Wes stepped forward from where he'd been standing near the tent pole, phone already in his hand, screen turned outward so the nearest tables could see it without me having to describe it. It shows 2 mute commands sent from that laptop, both during my toast, both seconds after I started speaking, sent by the same person who's been approving invoices to Leon Party Rentals for years. The room had gone past quiet into something closer to held breath. Melissa's hand moved before the rest of her seemed to decide it should, reaching under the edge of the bar toward her laptop. Fast, the way you reach for something out of instinct rather than thought. I saw her fingers hit a key. I saw her look up toward my microphone, waiting for it to go dead the way it had the night before, waiting for that small, cruel magic trick to save her one more time. Nothing happened. My voice kept going, steady, unbroken, coming through a speaker that had never once been wired into anything she could touch. I watched her press the key again, harder, like the problem was her own hand and not her own reach. It's a different system, I said, quiet, almost gentle, because there was no need to raise my voice over something that had already made its own point. Independent power, independent receivers. Nothing on this rig touches your board. It hasn't since this afternoon. I let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. You can't mute me tonight. Somewhere behind her, a few guests who'd clearly been at the rehearsal dinner the night before were doing their own quiet math, glancing at each other, glancing at my mother, understanding all at once what they'd actually watched happen under those string lights. My mother hadn't said a word. She stood very still near the cake table, one hand pressed flat against her stomach, staring at her older daughter with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Something between disbelief and the particular grief of realizing you built your whole comfortable understanding of a person on a story they told you and you never once checked. Dennis moved first. He crossed the small distance from where he'd been standing with his brother and put himself beside my mother, not touching her, just close. The way you stand near someone when you're deciding, in real time, whether you're still standing with them at all. Stephen folded the amendment closed, gently, like it had already done everything it needed to do. "There'll be a formal process for the restitution claim," he said, to the room more than to Melissa specifically, "handled through counsel. Not tonight. Not like this. But the ownership question isn't a question anymore. It's settled. It was settled 8 months before Valerie passed. It just took this long for anyone to read it out loud." Melissa hadn't moved from behind the bar. Her hand was still resting on the laptop, uselessly, the way you keep holding a phone after the call's already ended, like putting it down would make the silence more real than it already was. I looked at my mother one more time, at the smile that was long gone now, at the hand pressed to her stomach, and I thought about every table she'd ever charmed with a story about how generous her older daughter was to host things here for free. I didn't say any of that out loud. I didn't need to. The room had already heard everything it needed to hear, and for the first time since I could remember, the quiet in that tent wasn't the kind anyone in my family had arranged on purpose. I did not answer her right away. Melissa's hand hit the trackpad a third time, and a third time nothing on that stage went quiet, and I watched something in her face give way, the particular collapse of a person who has always had a tool for this and just found out the tool doesn't work anymore. "This is a setup," she said, louder now, loud enough that the nearest tables put their forks down. "You planned this. On my sister's wedding day, you planned this." "I planned a backup microphone," I said. "You planned the reason I needed one." A few guests actually laughed, short and startled, the kind of laugh that escapes before anyone decides whether laughing is allowed. Melissa's eyes cut toward them and then away, like she couldn't stand to see who'd heard. Wes hadn't moved from where he stood near the tent pole. He held the phone steady, screen still turned outward, and when Melissa took a step toward him, reaching, he simply stepped back and kept the screen where it was. "You don't need to touch it," he said, not unkindly. "It's already been exported." Time-stamped copies went to Stephen and to Craig this afternoon. This is just the one I happened to have in my pocket. That was the moment I watched her stop fighting the log itself and start looking for somewhere else to stand. Her eyes found my mother. "Mom," she said, "tell them. Tell them this is insane." I turned to look at my mother, too, because I wanted to see what she'd do with that, whether she'd finally say the thing out loud or keep doing what she'd always done, which was smile until the smiling stopped working. She didn't smile. Her hand was still pressed flat against her stomach, and when she spoke, her voice came out smaller than I'd ever heard it, not because she was sorry yet, but because she hadn't planned what to say, and it showed. "Melissa runs that venue like it's her whole life," she said. "You have no idea what she's put into it. If she took a little extra for herself over the years, for everything she's done, I don't think that's the crime everyone's making it out to be." I heard it land across 3 tables at once, the particular quiet of 200 people realizing a second person just confessed to something without meaning to. Craig Patel didn't raise his voice either. He simply opened the folder again, to a different tab, one I hadn't seen that morning. "There's an email," he said, "from an account registered to Lori Rogers 4 years ago to the account manager at Leon Party Rentals, approving what's described in the message as, quote, a standard service adjustment on invoices going forward. It doesn't name a dollar figure, but it's the authorization that made the adjustment possible in the first place." He looked at my mother, not unkindly either, just plainly. "You didn't take the money yourself, but you knew where it was going, and you signed off on the mechanism." My mother's mouth opened and nothing came out of it for a second. Dennis, beside her, had gone very still, the stillness of a man doing arithmetic he'd never wanted to do about his own wife. "Lori," he said, quiet, just her name, and I watched something pass between them that had never passed between them in front of me before, some small private door closing. "It wasn't like that," my mother said. To him now, not to the room. "It was a business decision, Dennis. Melissa asked me to sign it because she said the vendor was raising rates and needed cover for the increase. That's all it was." "That's not what the email says," Craig Patel said, and he didn't say it cruelly, he said it like a man reading a thermometer. I stood there and let the quiet do the rest of the work. I wasn't going to raise my voice over something that had already made its own case. This isn't revenge, I thought, watching my mother's hand still pressed against her stomach like she could hold herself together from the outside. This is just receipts. Dennis stepped away from her then. Not far, 2 feet maybe, but 2 feet in front of a full tent is its own kind of sentence. He didn't say anything else. He just moved, and my mother watched him move, and for the first time all night, her eyes went somewhere close to what I'd call fear. Stephen let the room sit in that for a moment before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice had gone back to the flat, procedural register he'd used to read the amendment, the register that made everything land like fact instead of accusation. "To be clear," he said, "nobody's being arrested tonight. Nobody's being dragged out of this tent. What happens next happens through council, through the venue's board, through whatever civil process the family decides to pursue for restitution. But effective immediately, Melissa no longer has authority to act on behalf of Rogers Manor in any capacity. That includes tonight. That includes this reception." The venue's day manager, a woman I recognized from setup that morning, had come to stand near the edge of the tent at some point during all of this, arms crossed, watching with the particular blank face of someone who works events for a living and has learned not to react to anything in front of guests. Stephen caught her eye and gave her the smallest nod, and she walked toward the bar, toward Melissa, and said something to her too quiet for the tables around me to hear. Whatever it was, I watched Melissa's shoulders drop the last inch they had left to drop, and I watched her close the laptop slowly, like closing it herself was the only piece of dignity anyone was going to let her keep. She didn't look at me again. She walked out from behind the bar and past the dance floor and out through the side flap of the tent into the dark, and nobody followed her, not right away. Not even my mother, who stood frozen by the cake table with Dennis 2 feet away from her, and an entire wedding reception's worth of witnesses now quietly rearranging everything they thought they knew about both of her daughters. I felt Stephen's hand find mine. He didn't say anything either. He didn't need to. The band leader looked over at us from the side of the stage, uncertain, his hand hovering near the switch on his amp, like he genuinely didn't know if music was allowed to happen again yet. I gave him a small nod, the kind you give someone doing their job in an impossible moment, and after a second, he lifted his trumpet and started something slow, something nobody had requested, just to give 200 people something to listen to besides their own thoughts. I looked down at the clip microphone still live in my hand, the one that had worked exactly when it needed to, and I turned it off myself this time, no one else's hand on the switch, and set it down gently on the white linen beside the cake. "Come dance with me," Stephen said, low, just for me. I looked once more toward the cake table, where my mother still hadn't moved, where Dennis stood 2 feet away with his jaw set in a way I'd never seen on him before, and I understood that whatever came next for either of them wasn't going to happen tonight, in front of everyone, the way it had for Melissa. That would come later, quieter, in its own time. "Yes," I said, and I let my husband walk me out onto the floor, past tables still murmuring, past my sister's empty seat behind the bar, out into the gold light and the slow trumpet, and for the first time since the string lights had gone dark the night before, nothing in that tent belonged to anyone but me. I set my hand at the small of Stephen's back and let him turn me once, slow, and over his shoulder I watched the tent start breathing again. Not fast. Nobody rushed to fill the quiet, but the trumpet kept going, low and easy, and a few couples near the edge of the dance floor started swaying just to have something to do with their hands. Wes had already folded his laptop closed. I watched him tuck it under his arm and lean toward the sound engineer who'd run my own rig, the two of them talking with their heads close, checking something on a second screen. I didn't need to hear what they were saying. I already knew the only thing that mattered. It had worked. It had worked exactly once, at exactly the moment it needed to, and that was the whole design of it. The venue's day manager crossed the grass toward the parking area a few minutes later, phone against her ear, and past the tent flap I caught a glimpse of headlights swinging wide out of the lot. I didn't ask where Melissa had gone. Some things you let happen without narrating them to yourself while they're happening. Craig Patel found Stephen near the edge of the dance floor while my Aunt Rhonda pulled me into a hug that smelled like the gardenia perfume she'd worn my whole life. She didn't say anything about what had just happened. She just held on a beat longer than usual, the way people do when words feel too small for the size of the room. "I'll have the demand letter drafted by the end of next week," Craig Patel said to Stephen, close enough that I caught it over Rhonda's shoulder. "Restitution figure's going to take a little longer. I want the full 4 years reconciled before we put a number on paper. But the mechanism's documented enough now that counsel won't have trouble making the case." "No rush tonight," Stephen said. "Tonight's not for that." Craig Patel nodded, closed the folder under his arm, and for the first time all evening I saw something almost like relief cross his face. The specific relief of a man who does careful, unglamorous work for months and finally gets to watch it matter in a room instead of just on a spreadsheet. Rhonda let go of me and held my face in both hands for a second, the way she used to when I was small. "Your grandmother would be so proud of you," she said, quiet, just for me. Not for the microphone, for not screaming. She never screamed either. I didn't have an answer ready for that, so I just nodded, and she patted my cheek once and drifted back toward her table, already leaning in to whisper to the woman beside her. And I understood the story of tonight was going to travel through this family in exactly the shape I'd let it travel. Calm and documented, because that was the only shape I'd given anyone to work with. Near the cake table, my mother still hadn't moved. Dennis stood the same 2 feet away he'd stood since Craig Patel read the email out loud, close enough to be seen with her, far enough that anyone watching would understand he wasn't standing with her anymore. Not really. I watched him say something to her, low, and I watched her shake her head, once sharp, like she was refusing a question rather than answering one. Stephen felt me watching and turned his head to follow my eyes. "You don't have to go over there," he said. "I know," I said. "I'm not going to. Not tonight." He didn't push. That was one of the things I'd learned about him over the 2 years we'd been together, that he knew the difference between a door that needed opening and a door that needed to stay shut until I was the one who decided to open it. The band leader caught my eye from the side of the stage again, and this time, when he lifted his trumpet, he wasn't filling silence. He was asking a real question, the small tilt of his head that meant, "Is it time?" I looked at Stephen. Stephen looked at me. Somewhere behind us, the MC, a cousin of Stephen's, who'd offered to do it months before any of this had a name, cleared his throat into a second microphone, one that had nothing to do with any board in that tent, and said the words he'd been holding onto since before dinner even started. If everyone could gather in for the first dance. There was a ripple of movement, chairs scraping back, people setting down glasses, and for a second the whole tent reorganized itself around us like nothing had happened at all. Like the last 20 minutes had been a storm that passed through and left the room standing exactly where it needed to be for the next part. I found that strange and almost funny. How a wedding just keeps insisting on being a wedding no matter what else is true underneath it. Stephen took both my hands. "Last chance to back out," he said, low, a joke we'd been trading since the morning. "Too late," I said. "You already read the amendment." "I heard it. I'm holding you to the part where you called yourself my husband in front of 200 witnesses." He laughed, actually laughed, the first unguarded sound I'd heard out of him since Craig Patel had opened that folder. And for a second, it was just us. Just the two of us in the middle of a dance floor with string lights strung overhead that hadn't been touched, hadn't been cut, hadn't gone dark once tonight. The band eased into the song we'd picked back in April, back when picking a song felt like the biggest decision either of us had in front of us. And I let my head rest against his shoulder and let my eyes drift once toward the tables, cataloging without meaning to. My father's brother leaning to whisper something to his wife, both of them watching Dennis and my mother with the particular fascination people reserve for a car accident they're grateful not to be inside of. A table of my college friends, wide-eyed, one of them already typing something into her phone, probably a text to someone who wasn't there, already turning tonight into the story she'd tell for the rest of her life. Wes packing cable into a case near the tent pole, methodical, unhurried, a man who'd done his job and knew it. And my mother, still by the cake table, still not moving toward the dance floor, though every other guest in that tent had drifted in around us in a loose ring the way they do, pulled by the shape of the moment, even when they don't decide to be. She stood outside that ring, alone in a way I don't think she'd ever stood alone at an event in her life, because for as long as I could remember, there had always been someone drawn to her, someone she was charming, someone laughing at whatever story she was telling about how generous she'd been to someone that week. Tonight there was no one standing close enough to hear a story, even if she'd had one left to tell. Stephen turned me slowly and the cake table slid out of view, and when it came back around a few seconds later, Dennis had crossed the last 2 feet. He hadn't taken her hand, but he was standing beside her now instead of near her, close enough that from across the tent it might have looked, to anyone who hadn't just watched everything that led to it, like nothing at all had changed between them. I knew better. I'd watched exactly what it cost him to close that distance again, and I understood, in the specific quiet way you understand things about your own family without anyone saying them out loud, that whatever came next between the two of them wasn't going to happen in front of 200 people with a trumpet playing. It was going to happen later, in a kitchen somewhere, in the kind of low voice people use when they're deciding alone whether 30-some years of marriage can survive one signature they didn't think hard enough about. I looked once more toward the bar where Melissa had stood an hour earlier, empty now, her laptop gone, the day manager's assistant already wiping down the surface like any other night's mess. Then I let Stephen lead me toward the cake, toward the knife with the ribbon tied around the handle, toward the next small, ordinary thing a wedding asks of you, and I understood that whatever else this night still had left to give me, the hardest part of it was already behind me, sitting quietly in a folder under Craig Patel's arm, done, dated, and no longer mine to carry alone. I reached the cake table with Stephen's hand still warm around mine, and Dennis stepped back to let us through, the way a man steps back from something he doesn't feel he has the right to stand too close to anymore. My mother stayed where she was. She didn't come toward the cake. She didn't have to. Every eye in that tent already knew exactly where she was standing and exactly why she wasn't moving. The knife had a ribbon tied around the handle, white satin, my grandmother's china pattern etched into the blade, the same knife she'd used at her own wedding 60-some years before mine. Stephen wrapped his hand over mine on the handle, and for a second, just a second, the only thing in the world was the two of us and a 3-tier cake and a photographer crouched low to catch the angle. "Ready?" he said. Quiet. Just for me. "I've been ready since May," I said, and he laughed again, low, and I felt something in my chest loosen that had been tight since somewhere around the moment the string lights went dark the night before. We cut it together, the two of us, the knife sliding clean through white frosting and yellow cake, and the tent gave us the applause a tent gives, warm, a little too loud, the specific relief of 200 people grateful for a reason to clap about something uncomplicated. I heard my mother's voice before I saw her move. "Congratulations, sweetheart." She'd crossed the grass without me noticing. Alone, Dennis still by the cake table's edge, still 2 feet of distance he hadn't closed back up. Her voice had the same warmth it always carried in front of people, the practiced warmth I'd watched her hand out to strangers at church my whole life. And for a second I understood she meant to stand here and let the cake do what the amendment and the folder hadn't, let the ordinary shape of a wedding paper over what had just happened in front of everyone she knew. "Thank you," I said. I didn't add anything to it. I didn't need to. She waited a beat, the way she used to wait when she wanted me to fill a silence with something she could work with, some crack of an opening. I didn't give her one. I looked at her the way Craig Patel had looked at her 20 minutes earlier, plainly, without heat, the look of someone reading a thermometer rather than making an accusation. "We'll talk," she said, finally, when it was clear I wasn't going to hand her anything. "Not tonight," I said. "No," she agreed, and something in her face flickered, not quite shame, closer to a woman recalculating how much room she had left to move in a house she used to run. "Not tonight." She turned and walked back toward Dennis, and he didn't step toward her when she got there, and I watched her notice that, watched her register the 2 feet he was keeping as its own kind of verdict, quieter than anything Stephen had read off that page, but no less final for how quiet it was. I turned back to the cake and let the photographer pose us for 2 more shots, feeding each other a small bite of frosting the way you're supposed to, smiling the way you're supposed to, and it struck me as strange how easily my face could do that now, how much practice this whole family had apparently given me in smiling through things. Craig Patel found us again near the edge of the dance floor a few minutes later, his folder tucked under his arm, his tie finally loosened the way a man's tie loosens after the hard part of his evening is behind him. "I'll need 30 minutes of your time sometime this week," he said to me, not to Stephen. "Just to walk through what the restitution letter's going to ask for so you're not blindsided by the number when it lands. It won't be small. 4 years of skimmed vendor invoices adds up in ways people don't expect until they see it typed out. Whenever works for you," I said. "I'm not in a hurry to see the number tonight. No reason you should be." He glanced back toward the cake table, toward my mother and Dennis, standing in their careful 2 feet of distance, and something crossed his face that looked almost like sympathy, professional and brief. For what it's worth, the email doesn't make her the architect of it. It makes her someone who signed a paper she should have read more carefully. Those are different kinds of trouble. Your sister's trouble is the kind with a paper trail built for the purpose of stealing. Your mother's trouble is the kind built out of not asking a hard enough question. Counsel will treat those differently, and so probably should you, eventually. Not tonight. Eventually. I thought about that for a second, the distinction he was drawing, and I found I believed him even as I filed it away someplace I wasn't ready to open yet. "Eventually," I said. "Not tonight." He nodded, satisfied with that, and drifted off toward the parking area, phone already out, already dialing someone, a man whose evening's work still had hours left in it, even if mine was mostly behind me. Wes came by next, cable case in one hand, the small tablet he'd used to route sound tucked under his arm the same way Craig Patel carried his folder, like these 2 men had spent the whole reception unknowingly matching each other's posture. "Logs exported and saved in 3 places," he said low, "just for me and Stephen. Cloud, a drive I'll drop with your attorney Monday, and a printed copy I already handed the venue's day manager for her file, since it was her board Melissa was supposedly answering to. Nobody's going to be able to say this got fixed after the fact." "Thank you," I said, and meant it in a way that went past the polite version of the words, for building the second system, for not telling me. He shrugged. "Easy. A man who did this kind of work often enough that tonight probably wasn't even his strangest wedding. You asked me back in March to make sure nothing could go wrong with your microphone twice. I just took you seriously the first time." He walked off toward the tech table to finish breaking down what was left of his rig, and I stood there a second with Stephen's arm around my waist, watching the tent breathe the way tents do, at the point in a wedding when the hardest formal parts are behind everyone and all that's left is food going cold, and a band that doesn't know yet whether to play something slow or something loud. "You look like you're doing math," Stephen said. "I am," I said. 4 years. That's how long Craig Patel said the invoices go back. 4 years of me showing up to Sunday dinner across the table from someone doing that, and I never once saw it in her face. "You weren't supposed to see it in her face," he said. "That's the whole point of doing something like that quietly. You don't get caught by people noticing your face. You get caught by someone finally checking the paperwork." I thought about Wes's tablet routing sound through a channel Melissa had never known existed until her hand hit a switch that did nothing, and I thought about Craig Patel's folder sitting open on a rental table under string lights, and I understood, in the plain, unbothered way I'd understood most things that day, that the two of them had just described the entire shape of tonight back to me without either of them meaning to. You don't stop someone by shouting louder than they do. You stop them by building the one thing they don't know is there. And then you let them walk straight into it in front of everyone who needed to see it happen. The band leader caught my eye again, and this time I gave him the nod without needing Stephen to look first. He lifted the trumpet and the rest of the band came up under it, something with a little more swing to it than the slow first dance number, and a few tables closer to the floor started to loosen. People standing, chairs scraping back again. The particular sound of a party deciding, collectively, that it was allowed to be a party again. My Aunt Rhonda appeared at my elbow with 2 glasses of champagne, handed me one without asking, and clinked hers against it. To the bride, she said, who apparently learned to read a room from somewhere in this family, thank God it wasn't from the 2 people standing over there. I laughed. Actually laughed, the sound surprising me a little, and I looked past her shoulder toward the cake table one more time. Dennis had said something to my mother, and she'd nodded, small, and the 2 of them had begun to walk, slowly toward the parking lot, not toward the dance floor, not toward the rest of the reception. I watched them go and felt nothing sharp about it. No ache, no satisfaction either, just the plain fact of 2 people leaving a party they no longer had any claim to run. "Come on," Stephen said, tugging my hand toward the floor where Rhonda's husband had already started something that might generously be called dancing. "I didn't marry you to spend the whole reception standing at the edge of the tent. You married me to keep 200 people fed and out of a lawsuit," I said. "I married you," he said, pulling me in, "because you're the only person I've ever met who can watch her whole family come apart in one evening and still remember to smile for the cake photos." He kissed the top of my head. Quick, easy, and out on the floor the trumpet climbed into something bright, and behind us the servers had already started clearing plates from tables where guests had abandoned their entrees an hour ago for something far more interesting than dinner, and the night, somehow, kept going. The band kept the swing number going, but I felt the tent shift again a few minutes later, that same low murmur moving table to table like weather. My father's brother had crossed to where Lori was standing near the tent's edge, his wife a step behind him, and I watched his mouth move, short and direct, no wasted words. I couldn't hear him from where I stood, but I didn't need to. I'd grown up watching that particular posture in my family, the one people use right before they ask a question they already suspect they know the answer to. "Lori," he said, loud enough now that it carried over the space between tables. What exactly did that amendment say? About the business? About Melissa? My mother's shoulders went up half an inch, the smallest tell, the kind only someone who'd watched her my whole life would catch. "It's a family matter. We don't need to do this here." "We're already doing it here," he said. "Everyone at my table wants to know why the groom stood up with a lawyer's folder instead of a toast." I didn't move toward them. I stood where I was, Stephen's hand still loose in mine, and I let it happen the way I'd let most of tonight happen, without inserting myself into it. Some things don't need me standing in the middle of them to be true. They just need enough people finally looking in the same direction at the same time. Rhonda drifted past me a minute later, refilled champagne in each hand, and leaned in close enough that only I could hear her. "Your uncle's been asking me the same question for the last 10 minutes. I told him what Craig Patel told the room, word for word, near as I remember it. He didn't love hearing it twice." "You didn't have to repeat it," I said. "I didn't have to," she agreed. "But somebody in this family finally deserves the truth without having to fight for it, and it wasn't going to be your mother handing it out." She took a sip from one of the glasses, which I was fairly sure wasn't meant for her. 4 years, Craig Patel said. 4 years of vendor invoices run through a company neither of you ever heard of before tonight. That's not a rounding error. That's a decision, made over and over every single quarter, by somebody who had every chance to stop. I didn't answer that. I didn't need to. She wasn't asking me anything. She was just saying it out loud the way people do when they've been sitting on something for 20 minutes, and it's finally light enough to say without the room falling apart around it. Across the tent, Melissa had reappeared. I hadn't seen where she'd gone after the amendment, after her hand had hit a switch that did nothing, after 200 people had watched her mouth open and no sound come out of the speakers that should have carried it. She'd found her way to the bar area again, no laptop this time, just her, in a dress that had looked sharp 4 hours ago and now looked like something worn by someone who'd been standing too long in one place, holding a posture she didn't believe in anymore. She was talking to the day manager's assistant, low, urgent, her hands doing the kind of explaining hands do when the words alone aren't landing. I watched the assistant's face, polite, closed, the specific blankness of someone who's been told, recently and clearly, exactly what her job requires her to say next. Whatever Melissa was asking for, the venue wasn't giving it to her tonight, and I understood, without needing to hear a word of it, that Wes's printed copy sitting in the day manager's file had already done its work before Melissa ever opened her mouth to ask for anything. She's trying to get someone to say it wasn't her, Stephen said quietly, following my eyes. The log doesn't leave room for that conversation. Wes built it clean, time-stamped channel by channel, her login credentials on both mute commands. There's no version of tonight where she gets to argue it was a technical glitch. I know, I said. I don't think she knows yet. I think she's still operating like it's an hour ago, when explaining things used to work for her. He squeezed my hand. It stopped working for her the second command didn't take. I thought about that, about the exact moment it must have been for her, standing at that laptop with her finger on a button that used to be able to silence me, and finding out, in front of everyone she'd spent her whole life managing the opinion of, that the button had been quietly disconnected from anything that mattered weeks before she ever touched it. I hadn't seen her face in that instant. I'd been on the small stage with Stephen, my back half turned, listening to my own voice keep going through a speaker she thought she'd already killed. But I'd heard the room. I'd heard 200 people go from murmuring to still, and I'd understood, even before I turned around, that whatever had just happened behind me had already told them everything they needed to know before Craig Patel said a single word of it out loud. Craig Patel found us once more near the tech table. Jacket back on now, folder gone, presumably locked in a car somewhere. I spoke with the venue's day manager, he said. She's aware Melissa's role with Rogers Manor terminates as of tonight, per the amendment. She's already adjusted the vendor contact list going forward. That's not something I asked her to do. That's something she did on her own, the second she read what I gave her. That was fast, I said. People move fast when they've been quietly uncomfortable with someone for longer than they've let on, he said. You'd be surprised how many folks in this business had a bad feeling about those Leon Party rentals invoices and never had the standing to say so. Tonight gave them the standing. He checked his watch, an old habit I imagined he never fully turned off, even at a wedding. I'll follow up with formal correspondence this week regarding the restitution figure. I don't expect that conversation to be pleasant for her. I don't expect you to have to be in the room for it either, unless you want to be. I'll think about it, I said, and meant that I probably would want to be eventually, once the wanting wasn't tangled up with tonight. He nodded and excused himself, and I watched him go find his own car, and I turned back toward the bar where Melissa still stood, alone now, the assistant having moved off to attend to something that had nothing to do with her. She wasn't looking at anyone. She was looking at the empty space on the counter where her laptop used to sit, like she expected it to still be there if she looked long enough, like some part of her hadn't caught up yet to the fact that whatever she'd built that laptop to control had already been dismantled around her, piece by piece, weeks before tonight, by people who'd simply stopped telling her things. I thought about Valerie then, the letter Stephen had handed me after the rehearsal dinner went dark, sealed, My name in handwriting I hadn't seen in longer than I wanted to count. I hadn't read it that night. I'd read it the next morning, alone, before Stephen ever showed me Craig Patel's report, and there'd been one line in it I kept coming back to all day. Something about how the people who inherit quietly are usually the ones who never had to raise their voice to prove they deserved to. I hadn't understood it fully at the time. I understood it a little better now, watching my sister stand alone at a bar with nothing left in her hands. Truth is the slowest receipt there is. It doesn't arrive with noise. It just arrives, eventually, exactly itemized. And by the time it does, everyone in the room has already done the math themselves. "Dance with me again," Stephen said, before I could sit any longer inside my own head. Whatever's happening over there is going to keep happening, whether you watch it or not. He was right. I let him pull me back toward the floor, back into the noise and the trumpet and the string lights that hadn't gone dark once tonight. And behind me I heard, faint under the music, my uncle's voice still going, still asking Lori questions she didn't have good enough answers for. The Wider family finally getting the version of tonight nobody had handed them permission to hear until now. I didn't go looking for the rest of it. I let Stephen turn me twice around the floor instead, and the story came to me anyway, the way stories do at a wedding, carried table to table faster than anyone could walk it. My uncle didn't let Lori off with silence. I caught the shape of it over Stephen's shoulder, my mother's chin lifting the way it does when she's deciding whether to answer a question honestly or just answer it quickly. "It wasn't the whole 4 years," she said, loud enough that I heard the exact words, even through the trumpet. "I only signed what came across my desk this year. I didn't know what came before that." My uncle didn't blink. "Then how'd you know to say this year, Lori, if you never looked at the rest of it?" She didn't have an answer for that one ready, and I watched her reach for her wine glass instead, which was empty, and realize it was empty, and set it back down like the emptiness itself had embarrassed her. Rhonda's husband, of all people, was the one who said the vendor's name out loud, plain as anything, over near the gift table. Leon Party Rentals. That's the same name that fella from the accounting firm said tonight, isn't it? 4 years of invoices through a company nobody in this family's ever hired for anything. He wasn't asking my mother. He was just saying it into the air the way you say a fact you want confirmed by nobody in particular. And 3 people near him nodded like they'd been waiting for someone else to say it first. I felt Stephen's hand tighten slightly at my waist. Not a warning, just a noticing. "You want to go over there?" he said. Not a question. "No," I said, and meant it. "I want to keep dancing until somebody else does the part that needs doing without me standing in the middle of it." He smiled at that, small, and spun me once more. And over his shoulder I watched Dennis detach himself from Lori's side and cross the tent alone, toward the tech table where Craig Patel was gathering the last of his things into his car keys and his jacket. I couldn't hear all of it, but I got enough. Dennis asked for a copy. Not the whole file, not tonight, just the restitution letter once Craig Patel had it drafted, sent to his own address instead of the shared one he and my mother had used for 30 years. Craig Patel wrote something on the back of a business card and handed it over without a word wasted on why. Dennis folded it once, put it in his breast pocket like it weighed more than paper usually does, and stood there a second looking back across the tent at his wife, who hadn't seen any of it happen. I thought about that small motion longer than I probably needed to. Dennis hadn't defended her tonight. He hadn't attacked her either. He'd just quietly arranged to receive his own copy of the truth, separate from hers, the way a man does when he's stopped assuming her account of things and his account of things are going to keep matching going forward. Lori found me near the edge of the dance floor a few minutes later, when the song changed and Stephen had gone to get us both water. She came at me the way she always used to when I was a teenager, and she wanted something to be over faster than it was going to be over. Chin up, voice pitched low and reasonable. Like reasonable was a tone you could just decide to have. "I want you to know I didn't know the extent of it," she said. Whatever that man's folder says. I signed things your father used to sign. That's all I did." "You said tonight it was 1 year," I said. "My uncle just asked how you knew that if you never looked at the rest." Her mouth opened, then closed. I watched her decide in real time which version of the sentence she was going to try next, and something in me went very quiet and very still watching her do it. The same stillness I imagine a courtroom clerk feels watching a witness search for a story that fits the last one they already told under oath. "I'm not going to stand here and defend 4 years of invoices I never saw," she said finally, which wasn't an answer to anything, just a sentence built to sound like one. "Then don't," I said. "Nobody's asking you to defend them. Craig Patel already has them documented. All that's left is what you do about your name being on the ones that are yours." She looked at me for a long moment, and something moved behind her face that I didn't have a name for yet. Not quite shame, not quite fear. Something closer to a woman realizing the room had already made up its mind about her before she'd finished making up her own. "You've been planning this," she said, quieter now. "All of it. Tonight." "I've been documenting it," I said. "There's a difference. Planning is what your daughter did with a laptop and a login. I just made sure somebody besides me was keeping score. I did not raise my voice saying it. I didn't need to. The words landed the way facts land, without any help from volume." She didn't say anything else. She looked past me, toward Dennis, who was still standing near the tech table with his hand resting flat against his own breast pocket, and something passed between them across all that distance, some entire conversation happening without a word of it spoken, and then she turned and walked toward him instead of staying to finish whatever she'd come over to finish with me. I watched them leave together a few minutes later, not toward the dance floor, not back toward the cake table, but out past the tent flap into the dark where the cars were parked. Dennis didn't put his arm around her. He walked half a step ahead, the letter still folded in his pocket, and she followed a half step behind. And I understood, watching the two of them go, that whatever came next between them wasn't going to happen tonight, in front of anyone, and it wasn't going to happen the way it always had before either. Stephen came back with 2 glasses of water and found me still standing at the floor's edge, watching the tent flap settle back into place behind them. "You okay?" he said. "I'm fine," I said. And I was, in the particular way I'd been fine all night. Contained, accounted for, nothing left owing that I hadn't already collected. I think that's the first time in my life I've watched my mother walk away from an argument instead of finishing it. "Maybe she finally ran out of a version that worked," he said. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe she's saving whatever's left of it for somewhere quieter than this. Either way, it's not my job to referee it anymore. Craig Patel's got the numbers, my uncle's got the questions. Dennis has got his own copy now, separate from hers. That's plenty of people asking her to account for herself without me adding my name to the list tonight." He handed me the water, and I drank it. And out on the floor, the band had shifted into something slower again, the kind of song meant for the part of an evening when people have stopped needing an excuse to hold on to each other. Rhonda caught my eye from 2 tables over and lifted her glass. Small, private, just for me. And I lifted mine back. Near the bar, Melissa still hadn't moved. She'd found a chair at some point, and she sat in it now with her arms crossed tight over the dress that didn't look sharp anymore, watching the door the way you watch a door when you're waiting for someone to come tell you it's over so you can stop bracing for it to still be happening. Nobody had gone to sit with her. Not our uncle, not Rhonda, not even Lori, who'd walked right past that side of the tent on her way out without once turning her head toward her own daughter. I felt Stephen watching me watch her. "You want to say something to her?" he said. Not a suggestion, just a read of my face, the kind he'd gotten good at over the last year. "Not tonight," I said. "There isn't anything I could say to her tonight that Craig Patel's report and Wes's log haven't already said better. She'll hear from an attorney this week. She already knows what that letter's going to ask her for. Tonight, I'd just be repeating it. And repeating things has never once made them land harder than the first time they were true." He nodded and didn't push it, and out past the tent, the last of the daylight had finally gone all the way down, the string lights doing the whole job of holding back the dark on their own now. And somewhere behind us, the caterers had started quietly, boxing up trays of food nobody had gotten around to finishing, the ordinary machinery of an evening ending the way evenings end, whether or not everyone in the tent had finished settling what tonight had cost them. I watched Melissa sit there another few minutes, and then the day manager came back, this time with a clipboard instead of a folder, and I saw her crouch down next to the chair and say something low enough that I couldn't catch it over the band. Melissa's face did something I hadn't seen it do all night. Not anger, something smaller and more tired than anger. She stood up, reached into her clutch, and set something down on the little cocktail table next to her. A single brass key on a ring with a faded Rogers Manor tag, the kind that opens the side office where the reservation books used to live before everything went digital. The day manager picked it up without ceremony, the way you'd pick up a napkin someone left behind and slid it into her own pocket, and that was the whole transaction. No raised voices, no scene, just a key changing hands at a cocktail table while 200 people danced 20 feet away, most of them never even noticing it happen. "That's it," Stephen said quietly, watching the same thing I was watching. "That's the whole thing, not the report, not the letter. That key's been in her purse for years," I said. "She used to make a point of jingling it in front of me at Christmas. Told me once it was the only thing in this family that actually meant something." "Guess it still does," he said, "just not to her anymore." Melissa didn't look at the key again once it left her hand. She gathered her clutch, smoothed the front of her dress out of habit more than purpose, and walked toward the tent flap alone, past the gift table, past the cake nobody had cut a second slice of, past Rhonda's husband who stopped talking mid-sentence just long enough to watch her go, and then kept right on talking like she hadn't. Nobody called after her. Nobody stood up. I felt the old reflex in my chest, the one that used to make me chase her down a hallway with an explanation she hadn't earned, and I let it pass through me and out the other side without acting on it. The way you let a wave move past you in water, you finally learn to stand still in. "You're not going after her," Stephen said. Again, not a question. "No," I said. "She knows the way out. She's had 30 years of practice finding doors before anyone can shut them behind her. Tonight's the first time one shut before she got there." He kissed the top of my head, and we stood there a moment longer, and then Wes came over from the tech table. Tie loosened, cables already coiled around his forearm in neat loops. "Wanted to catch you before I loaded out," he said. Everything ran clean the rest of the night. Both mics, full battery, no dropouts. I'll have the exported log filed with Craig Patel's office by tomorrow morning if anyone else needs a copy for their records. "Thank you," I said, and meant it in a way that went past politeness. For the rehearsal dinner, too. For not just fixing it quietly and letting it go. "I don't like when somebody's voice gets taken away on my board," he said simply, coiling the last of the cable. "Especially not on purpose. Figured you'd want to know it wasn't going to happen twice." He shook Stephen's hand, congratulated us both again, and carried his cases out toward the gravel lot. And I watched him go the way you watch someone who did you a real kindness and never once made it about themselves. The band played 2 more songs, slower ones, the kind meant for winding a night down rather than keeping it going, and the tent thinned out table by table, the way weddings always end, not all at once, but in a long unraveling. Rhonda found me near the cake table before she left, pulled me into a hug that smelled like the same perfume she'd worn my whole childhood, and said only, "Your grandmother would have loved watching that key change hands tonight. She'd have called it overdue." Then she was gone too, her husband trailing behind her still talking about invoices to anyone who'd listen. My uncle left without finding me at all, but I saw him pause at the tent flap, look back once across the emptying tables, and nod, just to himself. the way a man nods when he's finished a piece of business he didn't enjoy but didn't regret either. Stephen and I stayed until the caterers started folding tablecloths and the string lights were the only thing left holding the dark at bay. And then we walked out to the car together, my dress gathered up in one hand so the hem wouldn't drag through the gravel. He opened the door for me the way he had at the very start of the night, before any of it had happened, before Melissa's laptop, before the second mute command, before a brass key came to rest in a stranger's pocket instead of my sister's purse. "Married," he said, sliding into the driver's seat beside me. "Officially, legally, and apparently with a forensic audit as a wedding gift." "Best one on the registry," I said, and for the first time all night I let myself laugh. Not the contained kind I'd been rationing out all evening, just laughing because it was true, because I was tired in the good way now instead of the braced way, because somewhere behind us, a tent full of string lights was being taken down over an evening that had cost my sister everything she'd spent 4 years quietly building on invoices that were never hers to write. He pulled out of the lot slowly, gravel popping under the tires, and in the side mirror I watched Roger's Manor go small and then smaller, porch lights still on, the last few cars still pulling away from the place my grandmother had built and left. In the end, to the granddaughter who'd never once needed a key jingled in her face to prove what she was worth. "You okay?" Stephen asked again, quieter this time, one hand finding mine over the console. "I'm okay," I said, and this time I let myself actually feel the word instead of just reporting it. "I think I'm going to be okay for a long time now. I just don't think tonight's the last of it. There's still a letter Craig Patel has to send. There's still whatever's happening in my mother's house right now, behind a door I wasn't invited through. There's still your sister somewhere out there driving home alone," he said, not unkindly. "There is," I said. "That part isn't finished. I don't think it's supposed to be finished tonight. Tonight was just the part where everyone in that tent finally saw the same version of things I've been holding on to by myself for longer than any of them know." I looked out at the dark fields going by, headlights carving out just enough road to see the next stretch and no more, and I thought about Valerie's letter still folded in the drawer of my nightstand at home, about the line in it I hadn't stopped turning over since the morning after the rehearsal dinner, about how much of tonight had already been decided, quietly, weeks before any of us walked into that tent in our good clothes, pretending we didn't know what was coming. "Home," Stephen said, more statement than question, and I nodded, and he drove us there. And somewhere behind us, in a house I wasn't in, a woman who used to have a key in her purse was about to have a conversation with her own reflection that none of us would get to witness. And somewhere behind that, a letter with a number on it was already being drafted, waiting for a morning that hadn't come yet. I did what he asked. I let him drive me home instead of narrating the rest of it in my head, and by the time we pulled into our own driveway, I'd stopped turning the night over enough to actually feel how tired I was underneath all that stillness I'd been running on since the tent. I slept the way you sleep after a long shift, hard and dreamless, and I woke up the next morning to my phone already buzzing on the nightstand, face down, the way it does when someone's been calling for a while and giving up between tries. It was Craig Patel's office. Not Craig Patel himself, his assistant, a woman with a clipped professional voice who introduced herself once and then got straight to the point, the way people do when they've been told to keep a call short. "I just wanted to confirm the demand letter went out first thing this morning," she said, "certified to both addresses on file. Mr. Patel wanted you to know it's done, not still pending. He said you'd want to hear that from us directly instead of reading about it secondhand." "Thank you," I said, sitting up, Stephen already stirring beside me. "Is there anything I need to do?" "Not from your end. This part's between our office and hers now. He did say to tell you the number in that letter matches exactly what he showed you the morning after the rehearsal dinner. Nothing's changed since then. He wanted that clear, in case anyone tries to tell you otherwise." I thanked her again and hung up, and Stephen propped himself up on one elbow, watching my face the way he does now, reading it before I've said a word. "That was fast," he said. He's been sitting on it since morning, I said. Since before the ceremony, probably. He was just waiting for the reception to finish before he let it move. I set the phone down on the nightstand, next to the drawer where Valerie's letter still lived, folded the same way it had been folded since the morning he'd handed it to me. And I thought about how much of what happened last night had already been decided in that drawer weeks before any of us put on our good clothes. We were still in the kitchen an hour later, coffee going cold between us, when a second call came in, and this one wasn't an assistant reading from a script. It was Dennis. I almost didn't answer. Some old reflex in me still expected a voice on the other end asking me to smooth something over, and I'd promised myself in the car last night that I was done being anyone's referee. But his name on the screen looked different than it usually did, and I picked up. "I'm not calling to talk about your sister," he said before I could say hello properly, "or your mother. I just wanted you to hear this from me instead of finding out through somebody else's version of it." "Okay," I said, and waited. "I checked into a room in town last night," he said. "After the reception. I didn't go home with her." He said it plainly, no drama in it, the same flat delivery he'd used his whole life for things that mattered most. "I'm not telling you it's permanent. I don't know yet what it is. I just know I couldn't sit in that house with her last night like nothing had happened. Not after what was in that folder, not after watching her walk right past your sister at that party without turning her head." "I saw that too," I said. "I've been signing what she puts in front of me for longer than I want to admit," he said. "I'm not asking you to forgive that. I'm just telling you I finally noticed I was doing it, and I'm not doing it again until I understand what I've been signing." He paused, and I heard him breathe out slow, the sound of a man setting something down he'd been carrying without noticing the weight of it. "Craig Patel's going to call me too, I expect. I told him this morning I wanted my own copy of everything, not just the version your mother hands me at the kitchen table. He mentioned you took the folder," I said, "last night, before you left. I read the whole thing at 2 a.m, he said, every page. "I'm not going to tell you what that did to me because you already know. You've had weeks with it, and I've had one night. But I wanted you to hear that I read it. All of it. Not just the parts your mother tried to explain away from me on the ride home before I told her I wasn't riding home with her at all. I didn't have a response ready for that, so I just said, 'I'm glad you read it,' which was true, and simpler than anything else I could have offered him in that moment. 'There's a restitution number in there with your sister's name next to it,' he said. 'I want you to know that whatever your mother's attorney tries to argue about intent or oversight, I already know what 4 years of numbers add up to when somebody finally puts them in a column and adds them honestly. I'm not going to help her argue her way around that. Not this time.' 'That's between you and her,' I said. 'I'm not going to tell you how to handle your own marriage, Dennis. I've spent this whole year learning what happens when I try to manage things that were never mine to manage.' 'I know,' he said. 'I just wanted you to hear it from me before the family finds out some other way. Your aunt already knows. Rhonda's husband apparently can't stop talking about invoices to anyone who will stand still long enough to listen. And I imagine by tomorrow, half the people who were at that wedding will know exactly which key changed hands at that cocktail table and why.' 'I figured,' I said, 'and I found I wasn't bracing for that the way I might have a year ago. Let the family know. Let it move through them the way truth moves once nobody's left standing in front of it trying to slow it down.' We talked another minute or two, nothing urgent, just the sound of 2 people checking that the other one was still standing after a long night. And then he said he had to go, that he had a call scheduled with Craig Patel's office in 20 minutes. His own copy, his own questions, no one filtering it for him first. After I hung up, Stephen reached across the table and took my hand, and neither of us said anything for a while. Just sat there with the coffee going fully cold, the kitchen quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, and, somewhere outside, a lawnmower starting up 2 houses down, the whole ordinary machinery of a Saturday morning going on exactly as it always had, indifferent to how much had shifted overnight in a family that had spent 30 years pretending it never would. My phone buzzed once more on the table between us, and I turned it over expecting Craig Patel's office again, or Rhonda checking in, or one of the cousins who'd clearly already heard. It was my mother. Just her name on the screen, no message underneath it yet. The call cutting off to voicemail before I'd even decided whether I was going to pick it up. I looked at it for a long moment, and then I set the phone face down on the table again, next to my cold coffee, and I didn't listen to whatever she'd left. Not yet. There would be a right time for that conversation, and I understood sitting there in my own kitchen the morning after my sister lost the only thing she'd ever built with her own 2 hands, that this wasn't it. I let the voicemail sit there, unplayed, while Stephen made a fresh pot of coffee and I got up to shower and put on real clothes instead of the t-shirt I'd slept in, because that's a habit I never broke, getting dressed for whatever the day was about to hand me, even on a Saturday, even the morning after. By the time I came back downstream, my phone had 3 more calls logged. My mother again, then Rhonda, then a number I didn't recognize with a Rogers Manor area code, which turned out, when I finally checked the voicemail on that one, to be the property's insurance agent asking who he should list now as the primary contact on the liability policy, because the paperwork he had on file still said Melissa Rogers, and somebody had told him that wasn't accurate anymore. That was fast, Stephen said, when I read him the transcription over coffee. Craig Patel's office must have already sent the amendment to everyone who needed it, I said. Insurance, the county, the Caterers Association, probably the bank. He doesn't do anything halfway. He told me weeks ago that once the paperwork moved, it was going to move everywhere at once, not just in the room where we read it out loud. Do you want to call him back today? The insurance man. Monday, I said. Today I want to go out there and actually look at the place with my own eyes before I start filling out forms about it. I hadn't planned to say that until it came out of my mouth, but as soon as I heard myself say it, I knew it was true. 30 years I'd walked through Rogers Manor as a granddaughter, then as a niece invited under sufferance, then as an outside vendor's +1, and I had never once walked through it as the person whose name was now on the deed of trust. We drove out an hour later, the same road I'd driven the night before in the dark with my dress bunched in my hand, except now it was full daylight, ordinary and unremarkable. Cows in the field past the county line, a tractor moving slow along a fence row. The manor looked smaller in the sun than it did lit up at night with string lights strung tent to tent. Just a big old house with good bones and a wraparound porch that needed a coat of paint on the west side where the weather hit it hardest. The office door off the side entrance, the one that used to have a laminated sign on it that said, "Manager," was standing open. Melissa's desk was still there, but the drawers had been pulled and left hanging, and the shelf where she used to keep the leather guest ledger was empty, except for a thin layer of dust in the shape of a book that wasn't there anymore. She came and got her things, I said, mostly to myself. Fast, Stephen said. She's efficient when she wants to be, I said. I'll give her that. 4 years of skimming off Leon Party Rentals invoices takes a certain kind of efficiency, too. I stood in the doorway a minute, looking at the dust outline where the ledger used to sit, and I didn't feel the satisfaction I might have expected to feel a year ago, imagining this exact moment. I felt something quieter and less dramatic than that, more like closing a spreadsheet after you've finally gotten the numbers to balance. Not triumph, just completion. What she'd left behind, propped against the empty shelf where the ledger used to be, was a single sheet of paper, folded once, my name written across the front in her handwriting, the same handwriting that used to sign birthday cards to me with a little heart over the I in my name back when we were young enough that hearts over letters still meant something between us. I didn't open it there. I put it in my bag, and Stephen didn't ask what it was, because he could see on my face that I wasn't ready to find out yet either. We walked the property instead, room by room, the ballroom where the reception tent had backed up against the terrace doors, the kitchen where the caterers had been working until midnight, the little side parlor where Valerie used to keep her sewing machine, set up by the window because she liked the light in the afternoons. Everything smelled like last night still, candle wax and cut flowers starting to turn, And under that, the older smell the house always had, cedar and old wood polish, the smell that had been there my whole life and would probably be there for the rest of it now that it was mine to keep. Craig Patel called while we were standing in the ballroom, and I answered it properly this time. No assistant reading from a script. His own voice on the line, calm and unhurried the way it always was, even when what he was telling you wasn't calm at all. "I wanted to walk you through what happens next," he said, "now that the amendment's filed and the demand letter's out. The restitution figure covers the 4 years of documented discrepancies on the Leon Party Rentals account, plus interest calculated from the date each invoice was altered, not from today. It comes to just under $60,000. "That's a real number," I said. "It's a conservative one," he said. "I could have pushed harder on some of the earlier years where the paper trail's thinner, but I'd rather give you a figure that holds up without argument than one that gets your sister's attorney a foothold to negotiate down. She has 30 days to respond. If she doesn't, or if she disputes it without new documentation, we file in civil court and let a judge decide it instead." "And if she just doesn't have it," I said, "$60,000 isn't sitting in most people's checking accounts. Then we work out a payment structure, or a lien against whatever assets she has, or she doesn't pay it and it becomes a judgment that follows her," he said. "That part isn't really about tonight. That's a much slower process, and it's not one you need to manage personally. That's what my office is for." He paused. "I know this isn't the kind of wedding gift most people picture." I wanted to say, "For what it's worth, your grandmother built something worth protecting, and you protected it. That matters more than the number does." I thanked him, and we talked another minute about the insurance transfer and a few signatures Rogers Manors Bank was going to need by the end of the month. And then he let me go, and I stood in the middle of the empty ballroom with the phone still warm in my hand, sunlight coming in long through the terrace doors, dust moving slow in it the way dust does in a room nobody's cleaned yet after a party. $60,000, Stephen said quietly, coming to stand beside me. 4 years, I said. That's what 4 years looks like when somebody finally counts it instead of looking away from it. I thought about all the times I'd sat across from Melissa at this family's tables, watching her handle the accounts with a kind of easy confidence nobody questioned, because questioning her would have meant questioning our mother's judgment in trusting her with it. And I thought about how long a lie can run on nothing but everyone's reluctance to be the one who says it out loud first. We didn't stay much longer after that. There was a folding crew coming by that afternoon for the last of the tent panels, and I didn't need to be there to supervise it. Not yet. Not until I understood what running this place actually meant, beyond signing where Craig Patel's office told me to sign. We locked the side office door behind us. The brass key, Melissa's key, now sitting in my own bag next to the folded note with my name on it in a hand I used to know better than my own. On the drive home, my phone rang again, and this time it wasn't Craig Patel's office, and it wasn't the insurance agent, and it wasn't Rhonda. It was my mother's name on the screen for the 4th time since I'd woken up that morning, sitting there lit up in my hand while Stephen drove us back toward the county line, and this time, watching the number ring out on my lap, I didn't set it face down. I picked it up. Lauren. My mother's voice came through thin, like she'd been rehearsing that one word the whole time it took me to answer. "I need you to know I've been trying to reach you since 8 this morning." "I saw," I said. "I was deciding whether I wanted to talk yet, and now you do." "Now I'm listening," I said. "That's different." There was a pause on her end, long enough that I could hear a kitchen chair scrape against tile, the sound of her sitting down somewhere in that house I grew up in, the house that was about to feel very different once Dennis's clothes weren't in the closet anymore. "Your father told me he's not coming home," she said. "Not yet, anyway." "I know. He called me too. Of course he did." Something brittle came into her voice. Not quite anger. More like the sound of a person watching the last piece of a story fall into place after she'd spent 30 years arranging the other pieces so that particular one never had to be looked at. I want to say I didn't know, Lauren. About the invoices, about Leon, about any of it. I want to say that so badly. But you're not saying it, I said, because it isn't true. She didn't answer right away, and I let the silence sit there, instead of filling it for her the way I used to. The way I'd spent my whole life filling silences at that table so nobody had to sit in one for too long. Stephen glanced over at me from the driver's seat, just checking, and I gave him the smallest shake of my head, telling him I was all right, that this was mine to hold. I saw the numbers years ago, my mother finally said. Not all of it. Not the way Craig Patel laid it out. But I saw enough to know your sister was moving money around in ways that didn't add up. And I told myself it was small. And I told myself it was temporary. And I told myself she'd fix it before anyone noticed. Her voice cracked, just slightly, on the word fix. I didn't want to be the one who noticed. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I chose not to look because looking meant I'd have to do something about my own daughter. I understand it, I said. I don't think you want me to say it's all right, though, because it isn't. I'm not asking you to say that. Good, I said, because I can't. I looked out the window at the fence rows going by, at a red barn set back from the road with its paint peeling in long strips down one side, and I thought about how many years I'd spent trying to get my mother to look at me the way she looked at Melissa, and how strange it was that the moment she finally turned her attention fully my direction was the moment I no longer needed it to feel like anything at all. Not victory, just weather that had finally passed through and moved on. Your aunt knows now, my mother said. Everyone at that wedding probably knows by tonight. I have to walk into a grocery store in this town on Monday morning, Lauren, and every person in the produce aisle is going to know exactly what I let happen for 4 years. That's not something I did to you, I said. That's something that was already true. I just stopped covering for it. I know that, she said. Quiet now, quieter than I'd ever heard her. I've known that since about 11 o'clock last night, standing in that tent watching Lauren, watching you, hand that letter to Stephen's uncle, and then watching him read it out loud in front of everybody I've spent my whole life trying to impress. I kept waiting for you to look at me. You never did. I wasn't thinking about you in that moment, I said, and it was true. I was thinking about Valerie, about what she wanted for that place, and what it took to finally get it there. She never told me she was changing it, my mother said. The amendment. I want you to know that. I would have fought her on it if I'd known, and I'm ashamed to admit that. But I would have, so maybe it's better she didn't tell any of us. She told Stephen, I said. She told him exactly what she wanted and why, and she sealed it up and waited for the right morning to have it opened. She knew what she was doing. My mother was quiet again, and this time I let it stretch even longer, watching the county line sign go by out the window, the one that meant we were almost home. I don't expect you to forgive me today, she said finally. I'm not calling to ask for that. I called because I didn't want another day to go by with you thinking I didn't know what I did. I did know. Somewhere in me, I always knew, and I let it happen anyway, because it was easier than the alternative. Thank you for saying that, I said, and I meant it, even though it didn't undo 4 years of invoices or one particular night of dead microphones. I don't know what happens between you and Dad. That's not mine to fix. But I'm not going to pretend the last year didn't happen just because you finally said the true version of it out loud. I wouldn't ask you to, she said. We talked another minute, small things, whether I'd slept at all, whether Stephen's mother had gotten home safely from the reception, and then she said she should let me go, and I said okay, and neither of us said anything more than that before the call ended. No declarations, no promises, just two people who'd finally stopped performing for each other, hanging up a phone. Stephen turned onto our street a few minutes later, and I sat with my bag in my lap, Melissa's folded note pressed flat against Valerie's old letter inside it. 2 pieces of paper from 2 different women in my family, written years apart, saying 2 entirely different things about what they thought they owed me. I still hadn't opened Melissa's. I didn't open it that afternoon either. I carried it inside, and I set it in the same drawer where Valerie's letter had lived since the morning Stephen first put it in my hands. And I closed the drawer, and I let it sit there. Because some things don't need to be read today to be real. Some things can just wait until I'm ready, the same way Valerie's letter waited years for the right morning to be opened. I stood in my kitchen a while after that, looking out the window at the ordinary backyard, the grass Stephen kept meaning to mow, and I thought about how little of what happened over these last weeks had anything to do with anger when I really sat and named it. It had to do with counting invoices, counting years, counting every time somebody muted me in a room and called it help. Once you count something all the way to the end, it stops being a wound and starts being a fact, and facts don't need you to keep flinching at them. They just sit there. True. Whether anyone else in the family is ready to look at them or not. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from all of this, it's that you don't have to raise your voice to be believed. You just have to keep the receipts and wait for the morning somebody finally has to read them. If you're watching this from your own kitchen tonight, wherever that kitchen is, whatever city, whatever hour it happens to be where you are, I'd love to know. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now for you. And if this one felt like it understood something you've carried too, hit subscribe so you're here for the next one.